If your cucumbers are growing slowly, with pale yellowing leaves and weak, thin stems that just don't seem to want to climb, don't worry, because today I'm going to show you one simple trick that can bring your cucumber plants back to life in just a few days. All you need is yeast and sugar, two cheap ingredients you probably already have in your kitchen. And by the end of this video, you'll know exactly how to turn them into a powerful natural fertilizer that wakes up your soil and gets your cucumbers growing like wild again. Let's first understand why cucumbers slow down in growth in the first place. Because once you understand the cause, the solution makes a lot more sense. Cucumbers are warm-season plants, and they are extremely sensitive to temperature. When nighttime temperatures drop below 10 to 12 degrees Celsius, the roots simply cannot absorb nutrients efficiently anymore. This is one of the most common reasons for stunted growth and yellowing leaves, especially during early spring or late autumn when the days are warm but the nights turn cold. On top of that, inconsistent watering is a huge factor. Cucumbers have shallow root systems, and if the soil dries out even for a short period, the plant goes into a kind of survival mode, slowing down growth to conserve energy. And finally, there's the issue that most gardeners overlook completely, which is the health of the soil itself. Soil that lacks beneficial microorganisms simply cannot break down nutrients into a form that plant roots can absorb, no matter how much fertilizer you pour into it. You could have the richest soil in the world, but if there's no microbial life to convert those nutrients into a usable form, your plants will still struggle. This is exactly where yeast comes in, and this is the part most people don't know about. Yeast is a living microorganism, and when it's activated with warm water and sugar, it goes through a fermentation process that produces enzymes, carbon dioxide, and a whole range of beneficial byproducts. These byproducts don't just feed the plant directly, they actually stimulate the population of beneficial bacteria and fungi already living in your soil. In other words, yeast acts like a spark plug for your soil's microbial engine. It kickstarts biological activity, which in turn breaks down organic matter and existing nutrients into forms your cucumber roots can actually absorb. This is why people often see visible improvement within just a few days of using it, because you're not just feeding the plant, you're waking up the entire root zone environment around it. Now let's get into exactly how to prepare this solution, step by step, so you can start using it in your own garden today. Start by preparing 1 liter of warm water, somewhere between 30 and 35 degrees Celsius. This temperature range is critical, so don't skip this detail. If the water is too cold, the yeast will remain dormant and inactive, and you won't get any of the fermentation benefits we just talked about. But if the water is too hot, above around 40 degrees Celsius, you risk killing the yeast completely, and then you're left with nothing but sugar water. So aim for a temperature that feels comfortably warm to the touch, similar to a baby's bath water. Not hot, not cold, just warm. Once your water is ready, add about 10 grams of dry active yeast, which is roughly equivalent to 3 small teaspoons. If you don't have dry yeast on hand, you can substitute it with about 100 grams of fresh yeast instead, the kind you might find in the refrigerated section of a grocery store. Both types work well. The fresh yeast is just used in a larger quantity because it contains more moisture and less concentrated yeast cells compared to the dry version. Next, add 1 to 2 teaspoons of sugar to the mixture. The sugar is not for the plant directly, it's food for the yeast. Sugar acts as the energy source that allows the yeast cells to multiply rapidly and begin fermenting. Without sugar, the fermentation process would be extremely slow and weak, and you wouldn't get the same concentration of beneficial enzymes and microbial activity in your final solution. Now stir the mixture thoroughly for about a minute, making sure the yeast and sugar are completely dissolved into the water with no clumps remaining. Once it's mixed well, set the container aside in a warm spot, away from direct cold drafts, and let it sit for about 1.5 to 2 hours. During this resting period, something really interesting happens. The yeast begins actively fermenting the sugar, and you'll actually start to notice small bubbles forming on the surface, sometimes even a light foam layer. This is a great sign. It means the yeast is alive and working exactly as it should. The bubbles are carbon dioxide being released as a byproduct of fermentation, and this entire process is what creates the enzyme-rich, microorganism-activated stock solution we're after. After the 1.5 to 2 hour fermentation period is complete, you now have what we call an activated yeast stock solution. This is a concentrated mixture, and it's too strong to use directly on your plants, so the next step is dilution. For most established cucumber plants, you'll want to dilute 1 liter of this stock solution with 5 to 10 liters of warm water. Again, somewhere around 25 to 30 degrees Celsius, to keep those beneficial microorganisms active and comfortable. However, if your cucumbers are still young, weak, or in the very early stages of growth, you'll want to go much gentler. In this case, use only about 100 milliliters of the stock solution mixed into 1 liter of warm water. Young plants have delicate root systems that are still developing, and hitting them with a strong concentration too early can actually do more harm than good. Think of it like giving a small, gentle nudge to the root system rather than a big, powerful push, allowing the roots to develop steadily and build strength over time before you increase the concentration in future applications. One thing I want to stress here is that cold water should never be used at any point in this process, whether during activation or dilution. The microorganisms in this solution thrive in warmth, and cold water essentially puts them into a sluggish, inactive state, which defeats the entire purpose of what we're trying to do. So always make sure your water is warm every single time you prepare or dilute this solution. Once you've diluted the stock solution to the appropriate strength for your plants, stir it well one more time to ensure everything is evenly distributed throughout the water. You want every drop of that diluted solution to carry a consistent concentration of those beneficial microorganisms, because uneven distribution means some parts of your soil get a strong boost, while others get almost nothing. Now here's something really important that a lot of people get wrong, and honestly, this is probably the single biggest reason why some people try this method and don't see results. The formula itself is only half the equation. How you actually apply this fertilizer to the soil matters just as much, if not more, than the recipe itself. You could have the perfect yeast solution, but if you apply it incorrectly, those nutrients and microorganisms will never actually reach the root zone where they're needed, and all that effort goes to waste. So before you even think about applying the fertilizer, the first thing you need to do is lightly loosen the soil around the base of the plant. Use your fingers or a small hand tool and gently work the top layer of soil, being very careful not to disturb or damage the young, delicate roots underneath. This loosening process helps open up the soil structure, making it easier for water and nutrients to penetrate downward instead of just running off the surface. After loosening the soil, the next step is to water the area thoroughly to bring the soil to a moist condition before applying any fertilizer. This step is absolutely crucial, and here's why. Dry soil behaves almost like a hardened sponge. If you've ever tried pouring water onto completely dry soil, you've probably noticed how the water just sits on top or runs off to the sides instead of soaking in evenly. This happens because dry soil particles clump together tightly, leaving very few open pore spaces for water to travel through. But when soil is properly moistened first, those pore spaces open up, creating channels that allow water, nutrients, and beneficial microorganisms to move downward and spread evenly throughout the root zone. This is the difference between a fertilizer that actually works and one that just sits uselessly on the surface. Once the soil is moist, it's finally time to apply your diluted yeast solution. But again, placement matters here too. Don't just dump the solution directly onto the base of the stem. Instead, apply it in a ring around the plant, roughly 10 to 20 centimeters away from the main stem. This area is exactly where most of the fine, hair-like feeder roots are concentrated, the roots that do the actual work of absorbing water and nutrients from the soil. Applying the solution too close to the stem wastes most of its benefit, while applying it in this outer ring zone puts it exactly where the plant can use it most effectively. In terms of quantity, each plant only needs about 0.5 to 1 liter of the diluted solution per application. This might seem like a small amount, but it's actually the ideal range. Using too little won't provide enough of a stimulating effect to make a noticeable difference, but using too much can actually backfire, because oversaturating the soil reduces the oxygen available to the root system, which can suffocate the very roots you're trying to help. Balance is key here. More is not always better when it comes to fertilizing. So to summarize the correct 3-step application process, because this is the part you really want to remember. First, moisten the soil around the plant with plain warm water. Second, wait a few minutes to allow that water to soak in deeply and open up the soil structure. And third, only then apply your diluted yeast solution around the root zone, about 10 to 20 centimeters from the base. This sequence prevents the nutrients from simply washing away or evaporating off the surface, and instead locks them into the active root zone where your cucumber plant can actually absorb and use them. When you follow this method correctly, what you're doing goes far beyond simple fertilization. You're actively activating the entire microbial ecosystem living in your soil. Beneficial bacteria and fungi that may have been dormant or weak suddenly have the fuel and stimulation they need to multiply and thrive. This leads to stronger, more extensive fine root development, which means your plant becomes far more efficient at pulling in water and nutrients from the surrounding soil, even nutrients that were already present but previously unavailable to the plant. This is often why people report seeing their cucumber leaves turn from pale yellow back to a rich, healthy green within just a few days of the first application, because the plant suddenly has access to resources it simply couldn't reach before. Now, how often should you apply this yeast solution? For best results, I recommend applying it once every 10 to 14 days during the active growing season. This gives the soil microorganisms enough time to do their work and gives the plant roots time to develop before you introduce another round of stimulation. Applying it too frequently, like every few days, can actually overwhelm the soil's natural balance, so patience and consistency are more effective than rushing the process. As for timing during the day, it's best to apply this solution either early in the morning or in the evening, when temperatures are milder and the sun isn't directly beating down on the soil. Applying it during the hottest part of the day can cause rapid evaporation of the moisture before it has a chance to soak in properly, and it can also stress the plant when combined with high heat. Now, one question I get asked a lot is whether you can prepare a larger batch of the stock solution and store it for later use. The answer is, it's best used fresh, ideally within a few hours of preparing it, while the yeast is still actively fermenting and the microorganism activity is at its peak. If you let the stock solution sit for too long, especially at room temperature, the fermentation process will eventually slow down and the beneficial effects diminish. So rather than making a large batch to store for weeks, it's much more effective to prepare smaller, fresh batches each time you're ready to feed your plants. It's also worth mentioning that this yeast and sugar solution works wonderfully as a complement to your regular fertilizing routine. But it isn't meant to completely replace balanced nutrition. Think of it as a biological booster, something that enhances the effectiveness of whatever other organic matter or compost is already in your soil, rather than a complete standalone fertilizer. If your soil is severely lacking in basic nutrients like nitrogen, phosphorus, or potassium, you'll still want to incorporate some compost or organic matter into your gardening routine, alongside this method for the best long-term results. Now let's talk a little bit more about the science behind why this works so well, because I think understanding the why helps you trust the process and apply it with more confidence. When yeast ferments sugar in that warm water environment, it doesn't just produce carbon dioxide bubbles for show. The process also generates small amounts of natural plant growth promoting compounds and enzymes that interact with organic present in your soil. These enzymes help break down complex organic compounds into simpler forms that plant roots can absorb much more easily. At the same time, the sudden influx of yeast cells and their metabolic byproducts creates a temporary boom in microbial population and activity in the surrounding soil. This is sometimes referred to as a microbial bloom, and during this bloom period, the overall biological activity in that soil zone increases dramatically, which is exactly the environment cucumber roots thrive in. It's also worth noting that this method isn't some kind of magic overnight miracle cure for every possible cucumber problem. If your plants are struggling due to a serious pest infestation, a fungal disease, or severe nutrient deficiencies that have been ongoing for weeks, this yeast solution alone won't fix those underlying issues. It works best as a supportive treatment for plants that are simply slow-growing or mildly stressed due to cooler temperatures, inconsistent watering, or generally low soil microbial activity, which, honestly, describes a huge percentage of home garden cucumber problems, especially early in the growing season. Now, here's something really valuable that I want you to take away from this video. This method isn't limited to just cucumbers. The same yeast and sugar fertilizer recipe, using the exact same preparation process and application technique, works wonderfully for other vegetables in the nightshade and vine family too, including tomatoes, peppers, and eggplants, particularly during their early growth stages when their root systems are still developing and establishing themselves. If you're growing any of these vegetables alongside your cucumbers, and let's be honest, most home gardeners are, you can use this exact same solution across your entire garden bed, adjusting the dilution strength based on how mature each individual plant is. Young seedlings and transplants get the gentler 100 milliliter to 1 liter dilution, while more established, mature plants can handle the stronger 1 liter to 5 or 10 liter dilution ratio. Let me also address a few common mistakes I see people make with this method, so you can avoid them in your own garden. The first mistake is using water that's too hot, thinking that hotter water will speed up the process. This actually kills the yeast cells outright, and you end up with nothing more than sugar water going into your soil, providing zero microbial benefit. Always test your water temperature with your hand first. It should feel warm and comfortable, never hot to the touch. The second common mistake is skipping the soil moistening step before application. I know it feels like an extra unnecessary step when you're eager to get the fertilizer down, but as we discussed, dry soil simply cannot absorb the solution effectively, no matter how good your yeast mixture is. Always water first, wait, and then apply the fertilizer. The third mistake is applying the solution directly against the main stem of the plant, instead of in that outer ring zone where the feeder roots are concentrated. This is a small detail, but it makes a real difference in how effectively the plant can actually use what you're giving it. And the fourth mistake, which I see happen quite often with excited gardeners who want fast results, is over-applying the solution, either using it too frequently or using too much volume per application. Remember, more isn't always better, and giving the soil time to process and benefit from each application is just as important as the application itself. If you follow this method correctly and consistently, what you'll typically notice within the first few days after application is that the leaves that were previously pale or yellowing will start to regain a deeper, healthier green color. The stems will begin to feel slightly sturdier and less floppy, and new growth, whether that's new leaves, tendrils, or flower buds, will often start appearing more quickly than before. These are all signs that the root system has successfully absorbed the nutrients and that the beneficial soil microorganisms are actively supporting the plant's overall health. I also want to mention that consistency really is the secret ingredient here, more so than the exact precision of the recipe itself. Gardening, and especially working with living soil biology, is not about perfection. It's about creating favorable conditions repeatedly over time. Even if your measurements aren't perfectly exact down to the gram or the milliliter, as long as you're using warm water, giving the yeast time to properly ferment, diluting appropriately for your plant's growth stage, and applying it correctly to the root zone, you're going to see positive results. So to recap everything we've covered today, slow cucumber growth with yellowing, Weak leaves is usually caused by a combination of cold nighttime temperatures, inconsistent watering, and poor soil microbial activity. The solution is a simple, inexpensive yeast and sugar fertilizer that activates beneficial microorganisms in your soil. You prepare it by dissolving 10 grams of dry yeast or 100 grams of fresh yeast along with 1 to 2 teaspoons of sugar into 1 liter of warm water between 30 and 35 degrees Celsius. Let this ferment for 1.5 to 2 hours in a warm place. Then dilute it, using a stronger ratio for established plants and a gentler ratio for young or weak seedlings. Always moisten your soil first. Wait a few minutes, then apply the diluted solution around the root zone, about 10 to 20 centimeters from the base, using roughly half a liter to a full liter per plant. Repeat this every 10 to 14 days during the growing season, and remember that this same method works beautifully for tomatoes, peppers, and eggplants as well, not just cucumbers. I hope this simple, natural method helps bring your cucumber plants back to life and gives you that lush, vigorous growth you've been hoping for. If you found this helpful, try it out in your own garden and let me know in the comments how your plants respond after just a few applications. Wishing you a bountiful, thriving harvest this season, and I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye for now.